Thank you, Lashmi, and good morning and welcome everyone. I'm disappointed that I can't see you all in person, but at least we can have some virtual communion. It's better than nothing. So I'm here to talk to you this morning about my book, which, as Lakshmi mentioned, was just published a couple of months ago. And in it, it features my press model, which was outlined in the HBR that she mentioned, which sort of defines a roadmap for making profound and sustainable change on the issue of racial equity. In the interest of time, because I want to make sure that I stay close to my 20 minutes that I have this morning, I'm not going to go into deep detail, but I want to sort of highlight each of these 5 steps. The very first step to having a hope of a prayer of solving racism or any problem for that matter is knowing that there is in fact a problem. And that seems pretty simple and straightforward, but as you'll see in the next slide, it's not the case that everyone in the United States even agrees that racism is real and exists. And until we acknowledge the reality and existence of racism, that's going to continue to be an impediment in the resolution of racism. The second step, once you know that there's a problem, is to diagnose the root cause. So this would be similar to a doctor. So sometimes you can be sick and not have symptoms, such as some latent cancers, which is a problem because if you don't know that you're sick, then you won't seek treatment. But sometimes people experience symptoms such as severe headache, nausea. It's then the doctor's job to diagnose what's causing your headache. This isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's actually a practical necessity because headaches can be caused by lots of things. They can be caused by stress and anxiety, they can be caused by dehydration, they can be caused by coronavirus, and sort of knowing the etiology of a disease will inform the best course of treatment, which is why there's an arrow from root cause analysis to strategy. Knowing the cause will inform the best course of a solution. So knowing that there's a problem and understanding what's causing the problem are necessary but not sufficient. In addition to that, individuals have to care enough to want to do something about it. A patient has to care enough about getting well to even take the pills. No matter how effective the medicine is, if you don't take it, it's ultimately worthless. And there are many white people in America who may believe that racism is not really a big concern of theirs. They could be wealthy, male, heterosexual, and may actually believe that if anything, racism gives them more power, privilege, status. But assuming that people know there's a problem and they're concerned about fixing the problem, the next step is, do you know what to do? And as I mentioned before, that's the strategy that's often informed by the root cause. But I think the most important step is number 5, which is, are you actually willing to do it? Any strategy is worthless without implementation. So I'm going to go through each of these 5 steps, beginning with problem awareness. So my colleague in the business school, Michael Norton, along with Sam Summers, conducted a really interesting study about 10 years ago. And since then, it's been replicated by the Pew Foundation, by several survey agencies, the Ford Foundation, at Pluralis Unum, and then other empirical studies that have been published. And in his particular version of the study, he asked a large nationally representative random sample. And that's important because these results can generalize to the entire population. He didn't just ask high school freshmen. He didn't just ask a sample from West Virginia. This is a large nationally representative random sample. And he asked them 2 very simple, straightforward questions. First question, how much racism do you think there is against Black people in American society? Second question, how much racism do you think there is against white people in American society? And he asked them to respond on a scale from 1 being none at all to 10 being as much as you can imagine. To make the study more interesting, he asked people to look retrospectively at previous decades. How much racism do you think there was against Black people in the 1980s? How much racism was there against white people in the 1960s, the 1950s, et cetera? So let me draw your attention to 2 interesting aspects of the data here. The first is that when you ask Black and white people how much racism they thought there was against Black and white people in the 1950s, there's a high level of consensus. Both Blacks and whites agree that there's an extremely high level of racism against Black people, as you can see from the 2 solid lines. The mean response is between a 9 and a 10 on a 10-point scale, with whites being the solid gray line and Blacks being the solid black line. Similarly, both Blacks and whites agree that there's almost no racism against whites in the 1950s, with both blacks and whites putting the mean level of racism between a 1 and a 2 on a 10-point scale. But that's where the similarities end. Over time, whites are perceiving a very precipitous decrease in the amount of racism against blacks, as you can see by the steep slope of the solid gray line, concurrent with a steep increase in the perception of racism against whites, which you can see by the upward slope of the dotted gray line, such that by 2010, those lines intersect. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that white people now believe that there's more racism against white people than there is against black people. I'll say that one more time. White people, and you can say white people again, because this is a nationally representative random sample. White people now believe that there's more racism against white people than there is against black people. Black people don't agree. They think there's less racism against black people now, that we're sort of getting close to almost free. There's less racism against black people now than there was in the 1950s, but there's still a lot more racism against black people than there is against white people. So in addition, there is deliberate ignorance or motivated reasoning, which is the idea that people don't know because they don't want to know. And then we've also got cognitive biases, the availability heuristic. So many white people may see exemplars of black success, such as Barack Obama or Oprah Winfrey, and then generalize that to the entire group. There's also research showing anchoring bias, that many white people compare the current state of race relations to the past. And so they have a more positive or optimistic view of where we are compared to slavery, whereas black people tend to compare where we are to an ideal future, to Martin Luther King's dream, for example, and still notice that we have a long way to go. And then there's also people's lay definitions of racism. Many people see racism as an individual phenomenon that's perpetrated by hateful people rather than something that's more diffuse and systemic. And they also see racism as being blatant rather than something that can occur outside of awareness, intent, or control. Root cause analysis, where does it come from? Again, there's a whole thesis that could be written on the various pillars or origins of racism, including, as I mentioned, history, structures, the design, conditioning that goes along with those structures. Human cognition, in many ways, the way that we're wired as humans, both cognitively and socially, to form groups or tribalism, is amenable to various forms of bias, including racism. And then third, there's this whole issue of ego threat, insecurity, and need for power. There's a lot of research, including classic work on the authoritarian personality, that shows that at the heart of racism is fear. And then the next question is, now that we know that racism exists and have some idea of where it comes from, how much do we care about it? And I sort of identified three types of people. There are dolphins who are friendly, pro-social. They want to be part of a community, part of a group. They want to do the right thing. They're moral. Then we've got ostriches who are sort of indifferent, right? They can bury their heads in the sand. They're kind of apathetic. They don't really endorse racism. They don't really care about eradicating racism. They're just sort of like, what's best for me? What's in it for me? So these would be the individualists. Dolphins would be the pro-socials. And then we've got sharks, who are individuals and organizations that actively seek to create a hierarchy where they're at the top of the food chain. So these are people who have an active commitment to inequality. Based on research that I don't have time to get into now, there's a suggestion. Many people think that 95% of the world or 95% of people in society are dolphins. It's not true. It's slightly less than half. About 49% of people are dolphins. About 39% are indifferent or apathetic, what you might call the ostriches, and about 1 in 8 are actively sharks. So what can be done? Well, part of it depends on the individual, and I urge organizations to take a multifaceted approach. Many organizations think that it's enough to just talk and share stories and raise people's awareness of bias and how their actions contribute to bias. And I think that's a little naive because, as I mentioned, there are individuals, about 12%, that want inequality. They have absolutely no interest. And the research in social value orientation shows that it's really hard to get competitors or sharks to cooperate in the laboratory, that there are people who are inherently bent towards creating hierarchies, either dyadically or intergroup wise, and it's very difficult to get them to cooperate. So for those individuals, you need a stick. For people who are indifferent, who could go either way, a carrot would help, such as the business case, to say, you know, if you behave in X or Y way, there's something in it for you, or there's something in it for the organization, or we could increase our profits. So I think it's important to have a toolkit with moral appeals, incentives in the form of carrots, and disincentives in the forms of sticks. I think it's important to have policies or practices that say, this is what will happen to you if you behave in X or Y way. You can be dismissed from the organization, you can be put in jail, whatever it happens to be. And sharks only respond to sticks. So broadly speaking, there are three approaches to interventions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are those that are aimed at the individual. So these are interventions that change individual hearts and minds. And Calvin Lai, who's a professor at Washington University, has identified a lot of strategies that are aimed at reducing implicit bias among individuals. And what's really interesting is they did a meta-analysis where they looked at 17 or 18 different strategies, and really only 3 of them work. And they almost always involve some form of reconditioning of an individual, so showing positive images of Blacks and negative images of whites to sort of rewire people's associations between Black and negativity and white and positivity, or some form of close, meaningful, equal status intergroup contact. And those are really the only ways to change implicit bias. And even then, the change is often ephemeral, not lasting more than a day or so. And then there are cultural approaches to changing bias. This is the idea that we as humans in many ways are sheep, and we look to others and to shepherds to sort of tell us what is appropriate or what is inappropriate. And because we have this innate need to belong, and this mortal fear of ostracism, in prehistoric times, ostracism from the group would have meant almost certain death. People are strongly compelled to want to behave in a way that's consistent with informal rules. What's powerful, I think, about the cultural and the social is that none of it is etched in stone. None of it is law that says, you know, you will go to jail if you don't do these things. The punishment is really social disapproval, and that's enough. So there's a great study by Robert Cialdini and colleagues where they asked people to conserve more electricity. And they asked them what would be the most convincing reason for doing so: to save money, to save the environment, or because your neighbors are doing it. And people self-reported that their neighbors doing it is the least compelling reason. But then they put door tags on everyone's door in the neighborhood that had one of 3 appeals. They said, please save more energy because it will save you $100 a month. Save more energy because it will reduce your carbon emissions by 3,000 pounds a year, or do it because 85% of your neighbors are doing it. And then they snuck into people's backyards and they read their meters. And what they found was that by far the strongest impact on their actual reduction of electricity was what their neighbors were doing, despite the fact that people said that that would be the weakest. And then we've got institutional legal. These are changes in formal laws, policies, practices. Just one example is Massport, which is an agency here in Massachusetts that owns billions of dollars of land. And so they have control over which corporations can build commercial skyscrapers, hotels, convention centers. They actually own Boston Logan International Airport. And what they found was that everyone getting rich in the Seaport District, which is a very, I think 15 years ago, it was really that, a seaport district where people would offload lobsters and tugboats. But now it's this high-end district where we get lots of upscale restaurants, hotels, commercial office space, et cetera. And it used to be that they would choose the proposals based on whether they had the money, based on whether they had the team, and based on whether they had the right aesthetic and functional design. But then they changed the policy to add diversity, and they counted diversity 25%, the same as all the other characteristics. And what that did was it forced developers to look for women-owned architectural firms. It forced them to look for structural engineering firms that were owned by people of color. And it increased the representation of diversity from about 2% to 37% on average. So finally, sacrifice. Are we willing to do it? And often sacrifice involves managing trade-offs. So, one example that I give, and this is a study by Catherine DeSales, where it shows that the incidence of air rage is higher in airplanes that have a first-class cabin because people have to walk through first class in order to get to coach. I didn't know that, so didn't have problem awareness. But once I found that out, that then presented a trade-off between the comfort and convenience of first class and my commitment to human dignity, knowing that I'm complicit in people feeling diminished as they walk through first class to get to coach. And so the question is, which do I care about more, the comfort and convenience or people's dignity? And that's an example of what I call a trade-off. And similarly, there are trade-offs often for organizations between doing the right thing, quote unquote, and doing what's easy or safe or popular or convenient or profitable, with enslavement being the ultimate example of trading off the right thing for profit. Similarly, organizations often think that there's a trade-off between diversity, equity, and inclusion and fairness, or trade-off between DE&I and quality. So when I ask people, normally in a classroom situation, which is more fair, they say B. And what I help them realize is that B is equity, A is equality. So equality is treating everyone the same, equity is treating people differently, but in a way that makes sense. At the heart of inclusion is the question of how to treat differences, how to treat people differently in a way that makes sense. And we can come back to that later in discussion. But then the second question, and I'll end here, is will diversity affect quality? So if we look at this graphic, one could argue, if we take height as a proxy for ability, that the short person is simply unqualified to see over the fence. And why are we propping up short people? But if we look at it this way, everyone has the same height, but what's causing some people to be able to see the game is an unlevel field, which we can call privilege, and an unlevel barrier, which we can call discrimination. The blue person has low discrimination and high privilege, and it's for that reason alone, has nothing to do with their height, that they can see the game, whereas the yellow person has high discrimination and low privilege. If that's the case, are we morally, legally obligated to correct for inequities in the environment? And then finally, I want to just end by saying the best candidate, because you often hear this in organizations, is not a trait. It's not something that you can identify. It's an outcome. So I'm from Kentucky, as many people know. I'm from Lexington, and we just had the Kentucky Derby. And people show up at Churchill Downs thinking they know who the best candidate is, who the horse is, and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. They're willing to bet on it. And most people are wrong, despite the fact that there's a long history for all of these horses. There's a track record, which could be called a vita. They know a lot about these horses, and they still do not know who the best candidate is until the first nose crosses the finish line. Here's the second thing about that. Even if that horse wins the Kentucky Derby, it still doesn't mean that that's the best horse, because those same horses have to come back and run two other races in the Triple Crown, the Belmont Stakes and the Preakness. And often, most often, it's the case that the horse that wins the Kentucky Derby does not win one of those other horses. What that pretty much means is that there's a statistical ban, which means you have a lot of good horses, and there is no best, really. I mean, every once in a while, once a century, you have a horse like Man of War that in Lexington, there's lots of streets named after, which is just a legendary horse that no one could beat. But that's not an everyday situation. Usually, you have a situation where all these horses are good, and who wins on a given day is pretty much up to chance. And that's Sheldon Zedek's notion of a statistical band, that if you have 100 candidates, there are probably 12 of them that are interchangeable. And if that's the case, then look at those 12 that are good, do what you can do to develop them. This is the role of the jockey, because the jockey is just as important as the horse itself. That's who you might call the coach. And develop these individuals to realize their full potential and stop focusing on chasing unicorns, if you will, which is this whole notion of the best candidate, which is ultimately a myth. And so I would argue that there is no trade-off between quality and diversity. Thank you very much.